Good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you back to the Sunday webinar today. The session today is focused on the peaks, valleys, and plains of living. Today is Mother's Day, so I want to take this opportunity to wish all of you a happy Mother's Day. Those of you who are children, who are celebrating your mother's contributions to your lives, as well as those of you who are mothers who've given selflessly to the well-being of your own children. So happy Mother's Day to everybody. The topic today is peaks, valleys, and plains of living. And normally when we hear a topic like this, the place we go is how we have normally been trained to think, which is peak moments. You know, that life consists of peak moments when you're excited, passionate, in sync with the beauty of life and the joy. And then there are valley moments where you're experiencing deep pain and suffering. And then there are the plains where nothing really significant is happening. You're just doing the laundry, driving to a destination, and all of that. And viewed this way, there are well-defined streams of understanding, inquiry, and contribution that have helped us understand and be with the peaks, plains, and valleys of life. For example, appreciative inquiry talks about focusing on those moments when you're most excited and passionate about life and look at what made those moments possible. So if I look at the entire last week, are there a few moments that stand out when I felt totally passionate and excited about life? What were the life-giving forces in that situation? What made that possible? Another reference to peak experiences comes from the work of Abraham Maslow, widely recognized as one of the founders of humanistic psychology. In his book, The Farther Reaches of Human Nature, he talks about self-actualizing people as those who have peak experiences. In the Zen tradition, we have the concept of satori, those few moments when you're in sync with a greater sense of excitement and possibility, the mystery and enchantment of life. And so the peak moments have been studied both within the context of psychology and spirituality. The valleys, when we talk about valleys, I want to mention a couple of sources here. For example, Sangeeta Parmeshwar is on the call today, and her research work consisting of valley experiences. She studied the lives of 10 human rights leaders and some of those moments of deep suffering and pain that they encountered, and looked at through an analysis of those incidents. And I think she had a data bank of about 510 incidents of deep suffering and pain. She was able to look at how these leaders were able to transform that pain into different forms of social innovation. So suffering as a generative force in our life, not something that has to be denied. We also have the work of Warren Bennis, who built on that paper of Sangeeta's and wrote his own version of it called Crucible Experiences, where he interviewed people in organizations about experiences of pain, shame, disappointment, and suffering, and how those helped create new worlds of possibility. Osho himself adumbrated the concept of unsobbed tears, the fact that we carry many sadnesses consisting of moments that we have never grieved. And when something happens like a divorce or a job loss, these experiences become magnets that attract all the suppressed pain and suffering in our life. And how do we then go beyond the masks that we may have decided to wear to suppress some of the pain and suffering that we've had? As far as planes are concerned, we talk about robotic somnambulism, a condition that was very well distinguished by the Zen masters, who talked about how in modernity, the entire institutional framework of modernity is modeled after machines. And therefore, our life begins to resemble that of a machine. We become cogs in the wheel of a machine. We become robots, and we are going through life in a robotic way. Some of you might remember Colin Wilson's idea. If you're driving to a destination that's 30 minutes away from you, and upon your arrival, I was going to ask you how you got there. Many of us would have no recollection of how we got there, because there's a little robot sitting in the front seat doing the driving for us, perhaps while we are making lists of all the chores that we have to get into. So the mindfulness literature, building on the Zen tradition, talks about how do we bring a sense of wakefulness to these moments when we end up becoming, going through life like we are just a robot. brushing our teeth, driving to work, getting to our destination, participating in meetings. We are literally sleepwalking through life. How do we bring mindfulness as an emancipatory force, as a redemptive force in our lives? So this is how we normally look upon peaks, valleys, and plains. And of course, the peaks would vary depending upon your own makeup. There's some interesting work on philosophical orientations that talks about how each one of us tends to value the worthiness of an activity based on a different set of criteria. For example, some of us have a philosophical orientation which is pragmatic. If you're pragmatic, your peak moments would relate to those times when you believe you are you're enhancing your practical utility, you're maximizing practical utility. Whenever you feel that you are actually making a measurable contribution to improving your life, you would value those moments. Those with an intellectual value orientation would value those moments as peak moments when they acquire a new understanding, when they see something from a different perspective, when they have an aha moment, a set of insights. So that would be the intellectual value orientation. Now, if you inhabit what is called a human value orientation, you're somebody who values relationships immensely. So for you, your peak moments would center around people. Those moments when you had a chance to improve the density and strength of your relationships, perhaps when you bonded with people. And the fourth orientation that is explored is the spiritual orientation. If you're of a spiritual bent of mind, you might value those peak experiences that give you a new spiritual perspective on life, that enable you to deepen your spiritual practice, and so on and so forth. Now, I just told you what the rest of this webinar is not going to be about. What is the webinar really about? We are going to take a deeper look at the architecture of our own inner experience. And in doing so, I'm drawing upon a chapter, a very interesting chapter from Osho's Book of Secrets. Osho's Books of Secrets has 112 meditations to discover the mystery within. And in these 112 meditations, it's an amazing collection of some of the most amazing meditations with very clear explanations of the underlying transformations in consciousness that happen. Osho has a chapter on accepting the peaks and valleys of life. And the principal inspiration for this session is the chapter from the Book of Secrets. So I want to acknowledge the source. So we're going to take a deeper look at the architecture of our own inner experience, principally through a tradition called Tantra. Some of you might have heard of Tantra as a tradition. Now, what Tantra does, many wisdom traditions will create a division between what is positive and what is negative, what is good and what is evil, what is negative, positive, good and evil, virtuous and evil, and so on and so forth. The beautiful thing about Tantra is that it does not create those divisions. In fact, it enables us to get a deeper insight and understanding. Oh, beautiful kitty. Melinda, what's your kitty's name?
I had to unmute. Mojo.
Mojo, very nice. Very nice to have Mojo as part of the session. We welcome him with open arms. So the place where we create divisions of what is a peak and what is a valley, what is positive and what is negative, what is godly and what is animalistic. So we have to look at mechanisms like the censorship and suppression of the conscious mind. So for example, if we create a division, there's an inner war, like a civil war that starts within us. So for example, Osho reminds us that 99% of our processes are perhaps unconscious and 1% is conscious. And if 1% is conscious, which makes all the pious New Year resolutions and claims to practice the values that we love to claim are ours, that 1% is feeble. What is the chance that that 1% will prevail? The chances are that the 99% will win. And that is what happens often, that there's an inner division or conflict between us. We've created a higher part and a lower part, perhaps a godly part and an animalistic part, perhaps a positive part and a negative part, perhaps a peak or a valley. And if we are not saying yes to the whole of life, to the totality of life, we start this inner war. And the very beginning of an inner war means that you're going to be defeated. So what Tantra does is it teaches us acceptance as the stairway to heaven. Acceptance is the stairway to heaven. It reminds us that we are full of what we may wish to dismiss as animalistic impulses, but it cautions us not to. Sex, anger, greed, hatred, jealousy. We have these impulses, and rather than be able to accept them and to transform them through a process of acceptance, we start suppressing them and we push them into the basement of our being. Now, once they go underground, they're suppressed, and above the ground, we start creating a false structure. And if we create this false structure above the ground, and we have suppressed some of our darkest impulses under the ground, those are waiting to explode. So this phony structure is built sometimes out of religious practices, morality, and culture, which is above the ground, while Tantra reminds us that the real man or woman, the raw energies, are sometimes hiding inside. And what happens with the act of suppression is that any moment that underground volcano is capable of erupting. For example, I'll seem like a very nice and jovial and um, polite person, but the moment somebody turns and calls me a fool or an idiot or a moron, you will see that I will be all riled up. I will be defending myself, because the volcano has erupted. Now, Osho reminds us that there are literally three layers to our personality. One of them is a very thin layer. It's a cosmetic layer of social etiquette and politeness. Most of us get through the day in our office situations and personal lives by existing at that superficial layer of politeness. Now, sometimes the politeness is scratched by a recalcitrant colleague or somebody in our personal life who doesn't want to comply. And when that is scratched, there is a thick layer that emerges of suppressed anger, sometimes jealousy, hatred, and all of that. And we have to learn to be with it, to transform those energies. And the basic premise of Tantra is that if we continue to keep the suppression, we keep the suppression and we don't face the facts of what it is that we carry inside, we are going to be stuck at that layer. But if we are willing to accept ourselves in our totality, we are not striving for perfection, but for totality. We know that we are loving, but we can also be hateful. We know we are hardworking, but we can also be lazy. And we accept the total as opposed to waging a civil war against a part of us. When it surfaces, we are able to work with those energies and transform them. For example, in tantric terms, sex is a very powerful motive. If we are ashamed of our sexuality and we suppress it, the chances are that it'll turn into something like hatred, right? Or turn into something like shame. But if we are willing to accept our sexuality for what it is and work with it, then the sex energy to Tantra is the source of so much creativity. Sex is not about the physical aspect of sex. It is indeed a seed to the transformation, expression of consciousness. So in a way, although we don't want to talk about it as higher and lower, just to make the point, I want to talk about it as higher and lower, where the so-called lower energies that are more physiologically closer to us, or the ones that we are fleeing from, are elevated and transformed into higher forms of creativity. But the challenge, though, is how do we transcend the duality? Most of us have been raised in a way where we fall into the trap of looking at, excuse me, saintliness versus sin. We look at good versus bad, negative versus positive, and we have been wired into it. In fact, in our culture, often we are reminded, people will say, don't be so negative, be positive. How do we then transcend the duality when it has been so deeply programmed into us through our socialization experiences? I would say, look within your own life to find those experiences where you were able to collapse the duality. And if you look closely, you will find that you all, and we all have had many experiences where something that we viewed as negative actually showed up as something very positive. And we were able to see that we saw it as negative only because we did not have the depth and breadth of vision to be able to gain perspective. Often our understanding of an event is so circumscribed by the narrow confines of the immediate moment. We are often trapped in the spatial and temporal neighborhood of events that we are unable to transcend that proximity to be able to get a time transcendent and space transcendent perspective. Okay, so where in my life have I transcended duality? And the only reason I'm sharing these experiences is I hope that it'll, it'll evoke memories that you've had where you've overcome it. One of them comes to mind where I used to be up late studying for my final board exams as a high school student, and I had never studied through the year. And my last attempt at passing the exams and not staying perennially stuck in high school was to pull a few all-nighters and get through. So here I am studying for my exams. My dad enters. He says, "What are you doing? Why are you up so late? You should be asleep." And I say, "Dad, no, tomorrow is my high school exam. And if I don't pass this, I'm probably going to fail. So I have to stay up and somehow get through." He turns off the light. He says, "Go to sleep. Don't worry." I tell him, "But I'm going to fail." He says, "That's good. You will repeat a year, which means that you'll know the material much better at the end of the year." And he forced me to go to sleep and not prepare for the exam. It was just amazing. So any sense of shame that I had about failure was transcended. He began to see failure as not as bad. Similarly, as a young kid, I had many mannerisms which were obsessive compulsive tics that I would be performing, like grimacing my face or clenching my fist, and muscular spasms that would pass through me as a source of inner psychic tension that was trapped within me. And my father celebrated those. He said, "Wow, they'd make the life more interesting." I'd say, "People laugh at me in the street when I start doing these grimacings and I'm not able to stop them." He says, "Don't stop them. Let them laugh. Enjoy the fact that you're able to increase the volume of laughter in the universe. You're contributing joy. You're making people happy. Why worry about it?" And he brought a mirror. He sat next to me. He says, "You make faces and I'll make faces. And let's see which one of us makes the more interesting faces." Right? The other experience that I have was when I got promoted beyond my competence, and there was a colleague of mine who was trying to get me fired. She would go to the CEO's office and often and talk about how I needed to be fired because I was not competent to keep the job that I had. I had been promoted to head of human resources, and she didn't believe that I had the professional maturity or the personal maturity to be in that position. She would complain to him, and she would come to my office and say, "You need to be fired. You're utterly incompetent." And I actually made her my coach. And I said, "I want to hear from you. And I want to see how I can be a better human resources manager, because you're so committed to getting me fired. It must mean that you see something very deeply about my incompetence, and you're the best person to be my coach." And as a result of that experience, for 3 years, I won the Manager of the Year award because I made her my coach. Now, all of us have experiences like this where the dualities that we live in, friend and enemy, success and failure, have collapsed. So where in your life, ladies and gentlemen, is the question, have you tasted a dimming of the boundaries, where the division between work and play collapsed, where the division between love and hate collapsed, where the division between success and failure collapsed, and we were able to experience the totality, the oneness of it all? So part of the challenge here is that every one of us has created an image of ourselves, and that image becomes the barrier. Now, what Tantra would tell us is, if you are confined by the psychic prison of that image, you will never be able to reach higher levels of transcendence. You have to drop the condemnation, and you have to start dealing with the real energies that we are trying to hide from. For example, I have a friend who sees themselves as a very generous person. They think that are always coming from love and light and generosity. Now, what happens if you have such a self-image of yourself is that you're not going to be able to see those times or those parts of you that are selfish, because your self-image is so positive that it does not allow you to see the totality of who you are. So if I see myself as a very authentic person, I'm going to close off and not be open to those parts of me that are inauthentic. So I want us to recognize that the self-image that we construct often becomes the barrier. As Osho puts it metaphorically, the self-image is inside the house, and you never go into your own house. And he's metaphorically speaking about the house of your own being. Why do I not want to enter the house of my being? Because I might confront the real me there. And the real me is without makeup, is not nicely dressed in a suit, and I'm afraid to look inside. So what do? I'm waiting outside the porch. Now I have even left the house of my own being, because if I go inside, I'm scared that all the illusions that I've constructed about myself might be destroyed. So, one of the first things in overcoming the duality is to not condemn those parts of us that don't fit our self image. If we can reclaim those parts of us, the hateful parts of us, the selfish parts of us, the lazy parts of us, the ones that we have been resisting, as you know, you remember the old adage, anything that you resist shall persist. If we can embrace those parts of us that we have been fighting against, that we have demonized, and we go beyond the condemnation that we normally associate, a new door is open. For example, Osho reminds us from the Tantric masters that our own body is a treasury, he says, of hidden forces and mysterious possibilities. In your body is the whole cosmos in nature. For example, our sexual impulses are representative of the creativity that we contain, the power of creativity. Don't fight with it, but use it, and use the same creativity to create something greater. So allow the energies to express themselves, and they will gravitate towards something higher and higher and higher. Acceptance will be needed. As we said, acceptance is the stairway to heaven, because without acceptance, you cannot understand it. And here, Osho makes a beautiful point in this chapter. And the point that he makes is that unless you accept something and love something, you cannot understand it. That's a very profound point. If I don't accept you and I don't love you, I cannot truly understand you. You will forever remain a mystery to me. The same thing, if it is true of another person, how many of us know, do we really show ourselves to people who don't like us? We don't. We take the risk of showing ourselves fully for who we are to people who accept us unconditionally. There's an element of safety that is created and we bask in the sunshine of acceptance. And then we reveal our deepest mysteries and our inner beauty to people who look at us with eyes of love. So it is with for those parts of ourselves that we look at with eyes of acceptance, compassion, and love. We see more and more of the hidden mystery within us, and those parts of us that we reject will go underground. So the creation of a vast and inner total consciousness within us means that we have to look upon anything with love. Even the parts of us that we condemn, if we look at with deep eyes of love and acceptance, we begin to see the totality of the energies. If you want to know your own inner being and the multidimensional phenomenon of energies, says Osho, love. Love is the only way you can see the multidimensionality of your inner being and the inner beings of others. And then he follows it up with another quote: anything real that happens, happens through the animal in you, and anything bogus that happens, happens through the mind. It's a very provocative quote, which reminds us not to reject the animal within us, because often the so-called animalistic part, the part that we have suppressed and oppressed into the basement of our being, because we are not willing to accept ourselves fully, is what is running the show, is what is in the driver's seat of our life. Think about how many times we profess values of generosity. I see myself as a loving person, generous person. And how many times we notice that we seem to be existing in two parallel worlds: the world of what we espouse and the world of what we actually practice. Another very interesting idea that Osho brings up in this chapter, and you have to stay with me because it goes so counter to the kind of enculturation that we have been subjected to. He says, if you're positive, nothing is negative for you. If you're negative, then everything will be negative for you. So this is a very interesting idea. You know how easily we divide people into world into positive people and negative people, and positive experiences and negative experiences. What Osho is saying, that when you see some things as negative, it is not that the outside world is negative. It is that you're looking at it as negative. So I want to read this quote out. He says, you're the source of everything that exists around you. You are the creator of your own world, and you're not living in one world. So he says, If everything looks negative and everything looks destructive and everything looks inimical against you, it is because you do not have the positive center in you. If you feel negativity all around, it simply shows you're negative within. It depends on your mind. If you're positive, everything becomes positive. If you're negative, everything turns negative and sour. And he uses an example of a dog that is barking vociferously in the middle of the night, and a gentleman who's not able to fall asleep because the dog is barking. And he analyzes the situation. He says, do not fight the barking, accept the barking and listen to the barking. See the barking as beautiful. If you can see the vitality of the dog's spirit being expressed through barking, you have not made an enemy of the barking sound, you've not condemned the barking, then that condition will not disturb you. So I want us to want to invite you to try this parable or story or example into other parts in life. And I'm going to do that for myself in just a minute. So what he's saying is that we create conditions and we say that condition has to be met. So in this situation, the dog is barking. And if I've created a condition that I can only sleep if the dog stops barking, there is no way I'll allow myself to sleep because that condition has been created. And Osho talks about the ways in which we create conditions, then creates polarities that makes enemies of certain experiences. For example, if I say that in order to be happy, I have to be married, I will probably have a protracted period of sadness anytime I suffer an experience of separation or divorce, because I've created a mental model, a condition, an external conditionality. In order to be happy, I have to be married. And then I've made divorce and separation an enemy. Now, in that situation, I'm going to be constantly suffering in misery and in pain. But if I'm willing to drop that condition and just be with whatever separation and divorce brings up, sadness, depression, whatever emotions it brings up, and I don't necessarily consider them bad, I don't necessarily fight with divorce, and I don't fight with separation, and I don't fight with the sadness and pain that it might bring up, all of a sudden, I can attain to a different state of consciousness. And that is the essence of transcendence, of not creating preconditions, that these preconditions have to be met in order for me to be happy. It can apply to the barking of your neighbor's dog, or it can apply to a much more potentially disturbing experience like divorce. And he makes a joke about a husband and wife. So a husband uh, who doesn't know how to swim falls into the river. And all the villagers go and bring the wife and say, your husband has fallen into the river. You need to rescue him. The wife knows how to swim. She jumps into the river and starts swimming upstream. And the villagers say, what's wrong with you? Your husband fell into the river and he's going to be going downstream. Why are you going in the opposite direction? And the woman says, I know my husband. He is incapable of going downstream. He will always be swimming upstream. He is always looking to fight with me at home. He's always looking to assert himself and pick up a fight. Even if he fell into the river, it is inconceivable to me that he's going downstream. He's probably fighting upstream, going upstream. So I have a much better chance if I go upstream, because given his ego, he's going to be going upstream. He's not going to be going downstream. So Osho talks about this joke and helps us understand that if we are willing to swim downstream, the river itself becomes a boat. Once you float downstream, you have accepted the river, you have accepted the flow, you have accepted the current, the direction, and everything. So now, I know that many of us have logical minds, and when something like this is stated, we start finding those unique experiences where this generalization doesn't apply. Don't do that, because in the spiritual world, you have to surrender your logical mind. When we listen to great spiritual truths, we should not become focused on the one exception where it doesn't apply. We have to look at where in our life can we actually make use of this? Where in my life am I not surrendering to the inexorable flow of life? Where am I fighting a separation? Where am I fighting a divorce? Where am I creating an enmity with what a wild card that life has tossed towards me? The wild card that life has tossed is like a plaything. It's like a play toy boomerang. Let me just use that and play with it and play with cards of life. So I want to bring us to the final part of this presentation that I'm concluding. And this final part is very important because in this chapter in the Book of Secrets by Osho on accepting the valleys and peaks of life, he talks about the fundamental duality that we have not transcended. It is we are afraid of death. But then he says we are not really afraid of death, we are afraid of life. And he says you're afraid of death because you're afraid of life. And why am I afraid of life? He helps me with a lantern. He brings 3 lanterns of understanding to why I'm afraid of life. One reason he says I'm afraid of life, ego can exist only if it goes upstream. Ego is addicted to fighting. The ego is the basic cause of saying no to everything. When you say yes, you become a drop in the ocean, but in saying no, you become a big wave and you have a sense that you are separate, you exist. This ego, this thinking myself to be an isolated I, creates the ripples of negativity around me. For example, if I'm happily married, there is no ego. The ego starts melting. I have to say, you know what? I need a divorce because I need to assert myself and be an independent person. So often in life, we are fighting to stay upstream, to go upstream, because then we feel we are doing something worthwhile. We like to create crises in our life. In a different book called Joy, Osho says that when you don't have problems, you will start creating problems. You'll create molehills because otherwise your ego is dying and nobody likes a dying ego. The ego stands up and says, manufacture a problem because then you can create drama around that problem. You can start solving it. And then our ego makes a molehill and then it makes a mountain out of it. And then it starts climbing the mountain. And that's the ego-based pattern. The second reason why we are afraid of death, life, is because life is unknown, unpredictable, and the mind is very narrow. The mind, says Osho, consists of the past. The mind is the accumulated repository of all our past experiences. And therefore, the mind lives in routines and patterns. It moves in grooves like a gramophone record. But life doesn't conform to that. Life is unpredictable, is chaotic. It's a blooming, buzzing world of confusion, as William James said. So what happens is our mind tries to control. How many of us are aware of our need to control and fit the unchaotic nature of life into the Procrustean bed of our own control mechanisms? And here, of course, Osho is very cynical of marriage itself as an institution. So he says love is water and marriage is ice. You know, love is chaotic. It can come and go, right? You have no way of controlling it, but marriage is predictable. So he says it's difficult to live with persons. They might love you one day and not love you the other day. So we like to make things out of persons. We create a wife out of a beloved. We create a husband out of a beloved because the beloved is unpredictable, but the wife or husband has to conform to a job description, so to speak. And these words of Osho are so beautiful. The beloved was a happening, but the wife, he says, is an institution. So we give up the happening for an institution. And the third reason, and this brings me to the end of the presentation almost, is in life, in existence, there's a basic duality. Existence exists as a duality, but the mind always wants to choose one part and deny the other. So I want to choose marriage, and I want to deny separation and divorce. And that's why I will be in a tremendous amount of angst at this point in life. But if I can understand that marriage, the very idea of marriage also implies the idea of separation and divorce because life is a coin. You cannot picture one part without the other part. If I can accept that it's a coin that one side is pleasure and the other is pain. So we try to increase our sensitivity so we can enjoy the happiness and the pleasures of life. But in deepening our capacity for enjoyment, in deepening our appreciation of the ecstatic dimensions of life, we are also making ourselves more vulnerable to pain. You cannot. So if the tree goes very tall, says Osho, the roots have to go very deep. You cannot be somebody who can enjoy life very deeply if you can also not be capable of suffering the obverse of that situation, the pain, very intensely. Mind wants one thing and deny the other, because in life everything is related to its opposites. So then he says, in one moment, if you're happy, be prepared that in the other moment you will be sad. And he finally ends with this definition of an enlightened and liberated man that really resonates with me at this stage in life. So I'm going to end with that quote. He says, Osho says, I call a man liberated and enlightened who accepts the very duality of existence. Then he's positive. Then whatever happens is accepted. Then he has no expectations. Then he makes no demands on existence. Then he can float downstream. And then he reminds us that sound exists because silence exists. On that note, folks, I bring this recording to an end. As we all know, the format for the program is that we have the presentation part and then we stop the recording, and then we have about 20 minutes of stories and discussions and reflections for anybody who feels inspired by the moment to speak and share. Thank you so much. We are going to be meeting again 2 weeks from now in our next webinar, and I'll send you the invitation. We have moved from an every Sunday format to an alternate weekend format. So in 2 weeks, we will be meeting again. So I'm going to pause the recording now and ask you to unmute your mics. And if you can, if you're able to stay, we would love for you to stay for the discussion part. We would love for you also to unmute your camera so we can have a little bit of the much needed sense of contact that the Zoom seminar doesn't often allow us to. Thank you.